This is the third video for the Black Death. I'm talking about the effects of the Black Death on Western Europe in the middle of the 14th century. And I wanted to talk about the kinds of scapegoating that went on. This is connected to how people considered the Black Death to have originated. In this age, there's not a scientific method, there's no germ theory, there's this pervasive Christianity, and there's the kind of human nature to create us versus them groups and to try to find a cause to different things. All of this worked to really horrific effects with the ways that different populations were scapegoated as being causal agents of the plague, when of course they weren't. But a lot of people did horrific things, and a lot of people suffered horrific things beyond the plague when this happened. So scapegoating was common. There were three different groups, and I'm going to just mention them: poor people, people with leprosy or Hansen's disease, and then Jewish people. All three groups experienced blame at different times when the plague was experienced and populations wanted an answer, and they thought, hey, look at these people, they're bad, they're attracting God's wrath, it's their fault that all of this horrible stuff is happening. And so I want to talk first about the poor. I think it's really so depressing, and it also is relevant because recent papers have come out talking about who exactly was doing the kind of blaming. Frequently, when we hear about the scapegoating, the way that people have written about it, especially with anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish feeling, is that, oh, it was really something that the masses of people did. And so it's this kind of idea that the masses are stupid, and then that's why they did this kind of big lynching, effectively, of a lot of different vulnerable communities. And in fact, papers recently come out have challenged that a bit to say, no, that we can show wealthy people, elite people, often being the drivers of some of this scapegoating. So I want to mention, for example, this anti-Semitism. I said it was going to talk about poor people first. I'm talking about anti-Semitism first. There's a really horrific massacre in 1349 in the city of Strasbourg in modern Germany. And so there was a public burning of hundreds of men and women and children. And these were Jewish people, and they were just blamed for, I'll quote, this is a writer from the city of Cologne saying, there's a horrible means by which the Jews wish to extinguish all of Christendom through their poisons. So by making the Jewish people an other and then making people afraid of them, they often, Jewish people, experienced really extreme persecution. A lot of the different sources of this Strasbourg massacre of 1349 were done by people who were pretty heartless about it. But we have one account, a person named Henry of Hervodia, recording that Jews were cruelly slain, women with their small children cruelly and inhumanely fed to the flames. So not all non-Jewish people thought this was okay. Talking about poor people now. So that was another group. This is, I wanted to just give a quote from a person called Vicomte of Narbonne, and he wrote, "We believe that it is certainly the combined effects of the planets and the potions," in this case, it was thought that potions that were poisonous, made by poor people, were being dumped into wells. So it's definitely these potions which are causing the mortality. And then leprosy was another often factor. So very many times people were injured in this kind of sick response that was a kind of us versus them thing. It didn't ever turn to genocide, which is a desire to completely eliminate a group. These were more spontaneous but persistent outbreaks of violence against vulnerable populations. And sadly, I think that we can make a comparison with COVID-19 in the kind of rise of anti-Chinese sentiments that have occasionally occurred with people getting attacked, or the disease being referred to as the Chinese or Wuhan flu. If you use those terms, not you, if somebody uses those terms, they might not know how that can lead to kinds of us versus them thought and injury, but it has. So sad kind of parallel exists there. I want to now turn to talking about the economic changes. These are absolutely fascinating. I love this stuff. Who gets excited about economy? Dr. Senecal gets excited about economy. All right, so the thing is that nobody in the 14th century wants the plague to happen. But when the shakedown is done, a lot of people, especially in Northern Europe, are economically better off. And I should say Northwestern Europe. So it does depend on where you are. If you're in the Northwest, not as many people die. In general, the standards of living are much more improved. If you're in Eastern Europe, the changes aren't as positive immediately. So in the years prior to the 14th century's plague, or the bubonic plague, a lot of peasants were legally bound to the land, like almost like tenant farmers. This is serfdom. They couldn't go where they want. They have to give work for their lords and just turn over their crops to their lords. Not all of the crops, but a lot of them. And this was exacerbated by a kind of overpopulation. Well, when the plague occurred, all of a sudden, the kind of value of the laborer really increased. At first, supply goes down too at first because the supply and the population are down. But once the kind of demand starts to increase and rise again, workers are able to make great progress. And a lot of serfs stop being serfs. In fact, they become peasants that are free. They work for a wage. And that's something that's good for many, many Europeans. For the first time, they're having meat on a regular basis. That's not what was happening in the early 1300s. It's interesting because when we think about the positive effects on the economy from this, it has political ramifications. And so you can see on the outline Wat Tyler's rebellion, and then you also see Jacquerie Rebellion. So both of these things are examples of peasant revolts that happened in Northern Europe as the 14th century was going on, that where peasants would gather and try to press for more rights. So I'm going to show you a slide of Wat Tyler's rebellion here, or also known as the Peasants' Revolts. Oh, I forgot to show you. This is the burning of a lot of Jewish people in the plague. Here we go. So the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. And what you see is a ship, and King Richard is making a grand appearance. He is trying to calm the peasants down who want to take apart all of London. So a lot of the nobility were not happy that the peasants were able to work for wages and they could just like up and leave when they weren't getting paid enough. And so they started to enact laws like the Statute of Labors, and the peasants didn't like these laws. They didn't like the poll taxes when the nobility was like, hey, pay more taxes. And so they did have a revolt. It didn't immediately affect. So like, what happened is Richard, the peasants were like, yay, our king cares about us. That's great. And so Richard was like, yeah, we'll do what you want. And then he went away and immediately changed everything back in favor of the nobles. So it's not like something that immediately brings about a lot of benefits, but it's a sign of the times, as was the Jacquerie Rebellion. Jacquerie Rebellion gets its name from this peasant. So you like Joe Schmo. Instead, in France, you have Jacques Peasant. And so the peasants revolted. But again, it's not like these revolts themselves escalated change, it's more like an evidence that overall peasants had enough resources to be able to use leverage to get what they wanted. And so it's an overarching positive trend in Northwestern Europe in particular, not in Eastern Europe, where serfdom still lasts for quite some time. So that's part of the economic changes that I wanted to say. There's more to it than this, and I'll try, if you're in my medieval history class, I'll try to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Robin Hood, isn't it great that we know that King Arthur never existed, not even a germ. He's totally not real, less real than Santa Claus, no. But Robin Hood might have. It turns out that the word merry in Middle English refers to chaotic, not happy. And so Robin Hood, who stole from the rich and gave to the poor, was in fact, local kind of hero, like a superhero, but he was with a sort of dark, violent side. We don't really know if he existed, but the legends that come out of this time period suggest that maybe a person like him did, and regardless, the legends attest to a kind of idea that you have to, it's something you cheer for when there's all these rich people with tons of wealth, and you're going to redistribute the money to the poorer population. And so that too has a lot of resonance with today, not in terms of the specifics of a Robin Hood character, but in terms of like, okay, who's going to pay for all this stuff from this disease, and how many people are losing their jobs so they can't, have pay more taxes? What's going to happen? So I just think it's interesting to notice that my job is relevant. There. Okay, I want to talk about religious changes. This is absolutely fascinating. You know what? I'm not. I want to talk about cultural changes next. So I'm going out of order because this is easy. It's so much fun. People are so faced with the preponderance of death that it essentially affects their artwork. You can see appearances of skeletons becoming ever more pronounced in the artwork. This is the Très riche œuvre de Jean Duc de Berry. So here it's this idea that death is marching in, like they're always skeletons. I have different photos of a kind of typical artwork from the post-plague period called the Danse Macabre. And I love this because you can see all these skeletons and they're dancing. They're dancing with poor people, with church people, with women, with rich people, with extremely rich people, again with ordinary people, maybe from the cities. But death comes, and it comes for everybody, and it doesn't matter about your own social status. Everybody's at risk here. So I have another picture of the Danse Macabre that I wanted to show you. That is really interesting. This is pretty cool. It's from a church in Estonia. 15th century, so these are 1400s. Apparently this painting was originally 100 feet long. Only a smaller section of it exists now, but it's absolutely stunning, really beautiful, and it's influenced by Northern Renaissance art forms. So here's death holding a noble lady's hand, and it doesn't matter again who you're from, you're going to experience this kind of horror. I wanted to see if I put, okay, more stuff about the culture. Let's see, am I going here? I want to do this. This is pretty cool. This is an ossuary. So it's a building made out of bones, and it was recently discovered. So it's a pretty new find behind a church, a cathedral in Ghent. And these bones made up walls, and the church, the walls weren't built until the 16th century, but they're from bones from the bubonic plague or the Black Death of the mid 14th century. So it's pretty amazing. They were deliberately using the bigger bones, not the smaller bones. And it's a kind of, we don't know why, like, did it have a religious sentiment to it? But it's another example of the kinds of pervasive ways that death was present in medieval culture. So in a lot of art, one of the ways that medieval culture became expressive was in depictions of Jesus as a suffering human. So here's a Pietà. Most famous Pietà is Michelangelo's in the Vatican, but the image of Mary holding her dead child, her dead son rather, is one that was very, very popular in this period. And you can see Jesus is wasted away. I mean, you can see the gore on him. People would have reflected on that. Here's a crucifix. You can see the skin flailed away. So early medieval pictures of Jesus on a cross showed a conquering cross. Sometimes he's completely dressed. You don't even know he's being crucified. He's just sort of floating on a cross. And after the bubonic plague or the Black Death, the images of Jesus's gore and suffering really were very, very much more popular. People could relate to that. So to have a God that suffered with them and went through something that they also went through was super compelling for people in the Middle Ages. So finally, this rosary. If you're Catholic, this is not something that's unknown to you, but this is a practice that developed and got really popular after the bubonic plague, Black Death, along with the kind of fixation on the Virgin Mary. So Mary, the mother of Jesus, had always been popular in Christianity, in Catholicism, but she's really super popular in the late Middle Ages. As a person that is human, holding her God and Son, that was something that many people found just incredibly compelling. It was a kind of idea that no matter who you were, no matter how bad your sins were, Mary was like a mother to you. You could expect to receive a kind of love from her. This is kind of an interesting thing about when you have a single deity, like you have in the Abrahamic religions, when you have only one God and that God is omnipotent and omnipresent and everywhere, you have a kind of constant awareness that the God that sends love is also the God that is somehow also sending hard things, because everything comes from God. So one of the ways of negotiating this in the late Middle Ages was to have the kind of subunit, and I don't, maybe subunit isn't a good word, but the kind of fixture with the Virgin Mary, so that you could focus on her as being this very, very completely merciful deity. She didn't care if you were sinful. She would love you like a mother. And the adoration of Mary was expressed in the rosary. So you can see these beads that the Christ child infant is holding. And so in Catholicism, a very important meditative prayer, you'd have like a circle of these rosary beads and you'd pray. The little beads would be this prayer called the Hail Mary. The bigger beads would be the Our Father. And it just was a very, very popular expression, just to give some more indication about the cultural changes that happened as a result of the bubonic plague, Black Death. Also this one, another important figure that becomes ever more pervasive in artwork is that of Saint Sebastian. So he was a martyr saint. As you can see, he's usually depicted by being like shot to death with arrows, and he became associated with the plague. So if you wanted to avoid the plague, you could pray to Saint Sebastian. You weren't ever supposed to worship Mary or Sebastian. You were supposed to venerate, because you only worship God, but you pray to them. And the idea would be that Saint Sebastian could, through his holiness, he's definitely in heaven, he could try to use his closeness with God, and that could maybe help avert the plague. So that's some examples of cultural effects. I want to talk now about the religious changes. So we're almost done. The religious changes are pretty big. And there's two groups that I want to talk about. Everybody, ordinary people, and what their lives were like as a result of the Black Death, and then how the church hierarchy changed, because that's important, particularly for setting up how the Protestant Reformation comes about. But one leads to the other. So when I say changes to ordinary people's religious sensibilities, I'm also going to say the words popular piety. And, this is kind of so different from our ordinary experiences, whatever our backgrounds are. Obviously, in the country and in the state and in the city, the town that we're in, we're very influenced by Christianity, but not at all to the degree. You can't imagine the degree to which your religiosity really was intertextually woven in your life in this time period. So it's not something that we should think of as like, oh yeah, this other little category of people's lives. People's religious sensibilities shaped their whole sensibility. There's not a kind of way that you can think about a person's mindset without also including their religiosity in this time period. It's true, not everybody was Christian, not everybody was Catholic. There were Jewish people. In Spain, there were Muslims, but I'm not really talking about Spain in this lecture. There were people, and in my medieval class, we'll talk about more, they were called heretics. They identified as Christian though. So, however, most people would have been Catholic. Regardless, most people, this is the norm for society to think about religion in the ways I'm about to describe. So I talked about the flagellants, and I said that when you feel like you have a sense of control, it can be very, very comforting. And that was my attempt to make what the flagellants were doing not seem like a great idea, but to just be sympathetic so that we could see more of a connection than we would just without thinking of it like that. A lot of the changes that happened to people's thoughts about religion were also driven by a desire for control. Their loved ones all dead, like their worlds turned upside down. And it's felt very, very scary. As I showed you in the Danse Macabre, it comes for everybody and you just can't predict. And you don't know, is it, the stars? Is it so many different reasons why, are you near people? Is it smell? But regardless, getting a sense of control would have felt really powerful and been a kind of a way to deal with it through almost your mental health. Some of these things developed, these impulses were manifested in a belief in purgatory. Purgatory had existed as a concept in the 12th century, so that's like 1100s, but it gets very popular among ordinary people. Purgatory in the Catholic Church at that time and still is this idea that you can't go to heaven if you have sin. And everybody's got sin. So if you're a practicing Christian, your basic sin is done. It's atoned for by Jesus and his sacrifice on the cross. But you still have sin. You're not like perfect when you die. So how are you going to get to heaven? Well, you're going to have your sins burned from you, like a little mini hell, but burned to purge yourself, to purify yourself, like a metal needs purification and fire. And there was an idea that by doing good works, you could alleviate your time in purgatory. So like you're really, really bad, you did something very bad, but then you donate a whole bunch of money to a hospital. That's very good. So that takes away some of the bad. So the scales are kind of even, and therefore you don't have to suffer as much time in purgatory. Very interesting. And so what counted here for doing good could be things like charity, giving to hospitals. It could also do things like going to church, giving money to churches. Churches ran the hospitals, so sometimes those weren't different things. It could be giving money to the church in the form of indulgences. So indulgences, in my medieval class, we talked about how they really were started during the Crusades as these little slips of paper that in the Crusades, it was like you could go on crusade and it would be something that would remit your sins so that you could go to heaven right after you died. Well, by the time of 1349, when the first wave of the Black Death is through Europe, people want more, and they want to be able to say, okay, I know I have this horrific thing. I'm going to atone for it. Here's a big sum of money. please, can I have an indulgence? And something to realize is that this is consumer driven. Indulgences eventually were super abused by the church in a way that caused Martin Luther to start the Protestant Reformation. But in the 1300s, after the plague, they were satisfying a real desire that ordinary people wanted as a way to get out of purgatory, to control their fate. Other ways you could try to get your time alleviated was by constant prayer. So we have like Henry V of England. He would give enormous sums of money so that people would just constantly say Hail Marys. And every little Hail Mary would like tap away at that time in purgatory. All of this could be expressed in a book that became very popular called The Ladder of Perfection by Walter Hilton. And there wasn't a great picture of that, but this one's close enough. This is a 12th century, so much later or earlier Byzantine picture, but it gets at an idea that's, I think, kind of fun. So in this picture, you see all these people making their way to heaven, and then the little devils are like poking at them, and so they fall down and they go to hell. And then the angels are like, no, come on, we're going to help you up. This is similar to Walter Hilton's Ladder of Perfection. It was thought that your soul is a kind of journey, going on a journey up a ladder. You do good, you go up some more. You do bad, you go down some more. So it's this idea that if you work really, 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 really hard, you could work your way towards perfection, and that could help alleviate time in purgatory. You know, to me, when I hear about ideas of purgatory, I get so sad. I think, oh my goodness, these people, you know, thinking about people suffering after life is hard enough. Wow, that sounds tough. But if you conceptually have an idea that you don't die, your consciousness exists after you're dead, and so like whatever you're experiencing now, no matter how horrible it is, there's like part B, and it's in hell, a kind of hell, and you can't control now, but you sure can control part B, or what happens after you die. I mean, to me, that makes purgatory a lot more sympathetic of a kind of idea. So that is something that really is important for religious change. And I wanted to just point that out. I have the statute of laborers there. That was wrong. Sorry, just ignore that term. I wanted to show another aspect of the religious changes. I had mentioned in the culture this kind of fascination with the Virgin Mary, but there is an increased fascination with the body of Jesus. So what becomes really important is to focus on Jesus's suffering. And what becomes, as a corollary to that, is the role of the church services called the Mass in ordinary life. In the Mass, what would happen if you're Catholic or a number of other branches of Christian religion even today, the idea is that the priest is saying this sacred ritual prayer over bread and wine, and then really, truly changing that bread and wine into the body and blood of Jesus. So people began to focus on the communion wafers as a kind of point of devotion. Here you see the sacred bleeding communion wafer of Dijon, and you can see that it's speckled red. So it was a thing that people would like write about, focus on, because it's bleeding just like Jesus bled. It turns out that probably those red speckles, it's a kind of, it's a bacteria, and I'm forgetting the name of it, but stories about bleeding communion wafers and how they related and connected to Jesus were really important. This also connects to anti-Semitism, unfortunately, because a lot of horrific and not true stories about Jewish people somehow breaking into church, grabbing consecrated wafers, and then like trampling on them, because that would be something that would really make Christian medieval people horrified. Those stories were popular and drove up anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish sentiment. So I just wanted to mention that as another aspect of Christian culture. So changes to the church hierarchy. We're almost done. all of the kinds of ideas of giving to the church or wanting indulgences were driven by the common people, but the takeaway is that the church ran with this. So, hey, you're going to give me a bunch of money? Great. And that's something that plays out over 100 years later when the Protestant Reformation happens. And that's all I want to say here. I'm not going to talk, in my medieval class, I'll talk hopefully about the Avignon papacy and the kinds of other ecclesiastical corruption that happened in the wake of the bubonic plague or the Black Death. But I just wanted to really iterate the fact that it's these changes to religiosity are really driven from the ground up in terms of popular expression. It's not like there's a corrupt church and then the corrupt church then creates a system of indulgences and a belief in purgatory. The last point is changes in women's lives. So I'm going to just mention two things to remind us. In my medieval class, we read a bit of a work about how women's lives were experienced in the Middle Ages. And just a kind of reminder that family patterns drastically changed, especially in Northern Europe. So in Northern Europe, what was happening was the average age of marriage became older, and it was more equitable among many, many peasants and urban dwellers. So that means that women were having children later, like 18 versus 15, or the statistics are malleable, but it on the whole was later. And this changed the way that families existed. Marriages were held off until there was more of a financial independence on the part of the bride and the groom. And that's, in general, a good thing for women, to be able to have children a little bit later, healthier on the body. Also, to be able to have a little more age enabled a woman to have more say in who she married. Also, women, when they're married off very young, don't really give financially to their natal families, and so they're not as valued. But if you're a little older, then the peasant families could have gotten, a certain amount of labor from you. So that's good. Hopefully it's good for, good for the men too, because it wasn't like arranged marriages only affected women, affected men as well. In the South, in Italy, these patterns were different. Instead, in Italy, young women, early, like 15, were often married to people that were like 30. And this had a different impact, as you can imagine. So what would happen there is women's lives became more restricted. In Italy, you were really more closely chaperoned at times. If you were a younger woman, you obviously didn't have as much of a choice in whom you married. The men also had an interesting circumstance because they were supposed to be Christian, supposed to, not have sex until they're married, and yet here they are 30. As a result, a couple interesting things. Laws against homosexuality in Italy became very prominent because the idea was, oh, look, these men, they're going to just be only wanting to have sex with other men because there's they can't get married for so long. And so acts against homosexual practices, sex practices, became very prominent. Also in Italy, another response was that brothels became pretty regularly existing and also regulated, although the regulation of brothels was typical throughout Europe. So finally, last point before I go through the pictures and just make sure I have what I wanted to say, there's an occupational narrowing that happens with women in the later Middle Ages. I'm just going to mention that. So whereas we had more women doctors, more women lawyers, more women brewers in the first half of the Central Middle Ages, like 1000 to the years of the plague. Afterwards, there's not as many of occupations that women are able to take up. And the reason is kind of interesting. As the plague happens, it flattens out supply and demand. And then as demand starts to grow again, it just happens that the men tend to fill those positions, whether it's brewing ale versus, or brewing beer with hops versus brewing ale, whether it's being the pimps rather than having madams, whether it's really solidifying the need for a university degree to practice medicine. It's not without exceptions, but that's in general what happens. So I'm scrolling through, making sure that I've seen, oh, here, this is phlebotomy, just typical medieval practice. Why not lance the bugle and bleed people? And yeah, this is interesting. Take my history of science class. I teach it as summer term A, and you can learn more about medieval science. It's so fascinating. Absolutely. Oh, this is cool. Okay, I'm going to come back. I have one last point. I just want to make sure this is it. Yay. Okay, one last point. Here's a picture from the 19th century. I love, or early 20th century, I forget. But it's John Waterhouse, and it's Boccaccio's Decameron. So it's obviously much later than the Decameron, which was written shortly after the plague by Boccaccio. And I wanted to say it because I think we're all dealing with, or maybe not all of us, but a lot of us are dealing with social, or now we're supposed to call it physical distancing. And that has really tough mental effects. So Boccaccio's Decameron's introduction is the most famous recording of what people experienced during the plague. And however, that's in the introduction. As he moves through his story, he sets it up where these 10 people, men and women, gather to tell stories with each other. And they self-quarantine far from the city so that they're not going to get sick. And then they just tell all kinds of stories. So I just think that's kind of cool parallel. Obviously, we really aren't supposed to get together with our 10 friends face to face and tell stories. But an idea of how important it is to remain connected and the power of stories in keeping up connection, I think is a really neat, comparison or an aspect, a way to tie in the distant past to what we're going through today. Thank you so much for listening. And I hope everybody's safe. Be well, wash your hands, practice physical distancing, and hope to see everybody in the fall.